listening to the Grand Army of the Republic broadcast, the voice of the Outer Rim.
There are lots of fallacies you can come across in argumentation. I'm sure many of you fine folks out there have encountered this situation. Rey is a Mary Sue. She never undergoes any kind of training. She never fails, she doesn't have any weaknesses, and everyone around her loves her for no reason. A perfectly valid point, and there is plenty of evidence you can look at in the sequel trilogy which supports this claim. But then the rebuttal goes something like this. But Luke also defeats everyone and does everything without training. Now of course this point is false. Luke has light training in episode 4, and more training in episode 5. Throughout these two episodes he needs saving by the people around him, and he gets his ass handed to him by Vader in The Empire Strikes Back. He ends up being saved by the people he was going to save in the first place, because he didn't listen to Yoda and Obi-Wan and he paid the price. There's only a handful of times which Luke actually succeeds by himself within the first two films. These are usually piloting related. It's established that piloting is one of the only things he's good at. Now this is not a video about Rey being a Mary Sue, but I will point to my good friend LitDev, who has a video on the topic, link in description. But it doesn't matter if you agree with Rey being a Mary Sue or not, there is a fundamental flaw with the rebuttal which some of you may not have even noticed. It is in fact a whataboutism. The problem with whataboutisms is that they often ignore or try to dismiss the point being made, without actually countering it. It's lazy and flawed argumentation. It's also kind of used as a gotcha argument to try and prove that you're biased, usually towards being sexist or racist. The problem with these whataboutisms is that they never actually prove the criticisms to be false. They just point to something else claiming it's the same, either leaving out context or assuming it's not a problem in that media as well. They somehow think if Rey is the same as Luke, then it would somehow vindicate Rey of her horrible writing flaws that were brought up in the original criticisms. But in the best case scenario, we just end up coming to the conclusion that it's a problem in both media. You haven't actually countered the argument of Rey being Mary Sue. A more recent example I have encountered is when I have pointed out how stupid it is that Beskar can deflect lightsabers. As a rebuttal, people have said, what about cortosis? That could deflect lightsabers. This rebuttal did not address the point I was making, and instead decided to deflect, assuming that cortosis isn't also stupid. It's also not canon. The lightsaber is a blade of energy which can burn its way through anything, and metal has to be melted to be forged, and a lightsaber is probably a lot hotter than this flame here. So why wouldn't a lightsaber be able to melt Beskar? And this is also ignoring that plating your protagonist in this stuff removes a lot of tension from your story, because they're basically invulnerable. And in the case of cortosis, why would it cause lightsabers to just sometimes turn off? Again, there is no reason for why it would work this way. This is the kind of assumption a lot of whataboutisms make, assuming that cortosis is okay, so Beskar must be okay. They're trying to vindicate the topic of contention, but it in fact does not clear the topic at all, because we established that they both just don't make sense, and the conversation hasn't progressed at all. A lot of the time, whataboutisms also ignore context. A real one I've encountered goes something like this. Snoke died with no explanation of who he was or where he came from. The whataboutism response I have seen is, what about Palpatine? You never need an explanation of where he came from. This is the kind of whataboutism that ignores a lot of context. Palpatine actually had context for who he was. It's in his name, the Emperor. He's the big guy in charge of the Empire. And there is nothing which his existence contradicts. It's also hilarious, we have 3 films explaining his rise to power, but we don't need those films to explain who the hell he is. The big problem with Snoke is that he and his faction came out of nowhere, with no explanation. He's not in the original trilogy, he's not in the prequels, he's an insanely powerful guy with the resources to build an empire and a Death Star. We just have to assume he just popped into existence because we don't know who the fuck he is or where he came from. You see? Context. It's important. It's also important to remember that there is a difference between a whataboutism and showing evidence within a media to make a point or prove something false. There is a clear line of distinction. For example, If I say Ray is overpowered with no training, then I use Luke as an example that training is needed, and then Ray contradicts this by not training and she just knows advanced force powers and then defeats a powerful guy like Kylo Ren, then that is using evidence to make a point rather than to dismiss a criticism without actually proving it false. If, for example, someone says Ahsoka Tano is a Mary Sue, then I point to all the evidence which prove the claim false. For instance, losing all of her squadron because she didn't listen to her mentor.
Ahsoka, it's too risky. Get your pilots out of there. No turning around.
Did you train her not to follow orders?
Admiral, I am so sorry. They're all gone.
She gets outsmarted after not listening to her master and she gets captured. As a result, Bane gets the holocron. She is proven wrong in many situations.
Get in the ship, now!
Can't you see they're retreating?
They're about to overrun you, Ahsoka. You just can't see it. Now follow orders and get in the ship.
And these are flaws which she grows from and she overcomes. She's had training from a young age in the Jedi Temple, and she's still being trained by her Jedi Master. She has to rely upon and work with others, and she learns from those around her.
How many separatists have you met?
What?
Well, I mean, you think we're all the bad guys, but how many of us have you actually met?
The politics of this war are not as black and white as I once thought they were.
Even after growing up, she barely survived Vader. These are not the characteristics of a Mary Sue. You can say she's a retcon because that would be factually true, but the difference in the argumentation is I'm not trying to dismiss it by sidestepping it. It is in fact a rebuttal which proves the claim false. A whataboutism does not prove the claim false. In the best case scenario, it just shows that the criticism applies to both media. In most whataboutisms, they just ignore important context, or make faulty comparisons like the Rey and Luke comparison. Now, whatever the side of the argument you're on, this is a nice bit of friendly advice on how to not make an argument. This is something for you to avoid or better identify in the future, to help with your debates and argumentation. In the end, it's actually just best to counter an argument with an actual point and prove it as false, which you would think would be obvious, but there are a lot of people who lazily try to dismiss arguments rather than actually countering them. If you want to support this channel, then make sure to support me through Patreon, and make sure to subscribe to watch out for more. Thank you for watching, and this is Shiney, signing off.